Compared to previous spectacles, the 2026 annual Victory Day parade in Moscow was remarkably subdued. While the public did get to see the usual columns of tanks rumbling through Red Square, they did it from a unique vantage point, a video screen. The reason? Drones. Ukrainian drones are threading through the Russian capital's layered air defense network, and Russia was worried they would strike during the parade itself. In mid-May, the drones reached the Solnechnagorsk oil loading station, causing black smoke to curl over a city that Russian President Vladimir Putin had spent 4 years assuring his citizens were safely out of reach. The Moscow refinery, one of the most defended industrial facilities in all of Russia, has been struck. Moscow's airports have grounded every commercial flight within hundreds of kilometers for what feels like the 100th time. Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, posted 6 words to social media that morning: "Moscow from now on never sleeps." Let that sink in. Ukraine, a country that Russia invaded expecting to conquer in a weekend, is now striking the Russian capital at will, and it's not even using sophisticated missile systems that the West provides. No, it's doing so with drones that in many cases cost a few $1,000s, while they slip past air defense systems that cost tens of millions. The Russian government, in response, has placed Pantsir S-1 air defense missile launchers on the roof of the defense ministry itself. The seat of Russian military power is now wearing its own air defense system like a helmet in plain sight because it has no other choice. It has some speculating that Russia will never win in Ukraine. So, how did it come to this? The easy answer is drones. And yes, we're going to talk about drones a lot. But drones are not the whole story. The real reason Russia cannot win in Ukraine has nothing to do with NATO or sanctions or Western weapons or Ukrainian courage, though all of those things matter. The real reason is far simpler. Russia lost this war in the planning room before a single soldier crossed the border on February 24, 2022. It lost because of one catastrophic, irreversible mistake. Russia was overconfident, and by the time it realized just how badly wrong things had gotten, the window to fix it had already closed. So today, we're going to walk through exactly how that happened, starting with the war Russia thought it was fighting, going through the doctrine it brought to a fight it fundamentally misunderstood, and then tracing the chain of consequences, all the way to those drone strikes over Moscow that flowed directly from that original sin of arrogance. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what Russia's leadership actually believed would happen when it crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24, 2022. They believed it would be over in days. This was the operational foundation of the entire campaign. Russian logistics planners, this is documented, prepared resupply chains based on occupying Kyiv within 10 days. Note that this didn't mean capturing Ukraine entirely. The assumption was that once Russian forces reached the capital and the Ukrainian government collapsed or fled, resistance would evaporate, and the rest would be similar to what had happened in Crimea in 2014. As a result, tanks ran out of fuel and soldiers ran out of food. Not because Russian logistics were uniquely incompetent, but because the entire system had been built around a sprint, not a marathon. Think about what that actually means. The Russian military planned meticulously just for the wrong war, and the plan exposed everything: the overconfidence, the contempt for Ukrainian resolve, and most fatally, the decision to send a force that was large enough to make noise, but not nearly large enough to actually win. On paper, Russia had one of the most formidable militaries on the planet when it invaded. Hundreds of thousands of active duty soldiers, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, an aerospace force with more aircraft than almost any other nation on Earth, hypersonic missiles, nuclear weapons, one of the world's largest military budgets for years running. By pure numbers, Ukraine had no business competing with any of that. And Russia didn't use it. The initial invasion force was somewhere between 150,000 and 190,000 troops. This was a significant number, but not the overwhelming, all-consuming wave you deploy when you're serious about conquering a country of more than 40 million people. For context, the United States coalition deployed roughly 700,000 troops to liberate Kuwait from Iraq in 1991, a country with a fraction of Ukraine's size, population, and military capability. Russia's planners apparently looked at those numbers, looked at Ukraine, and decided they could do it with a quarter of that, on the assumption that Kyiv would fall before serious resistance could organize. Looking back, it's not fair to say Russia was completely out of its mind in thinking it could pull it off. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea in a matter of days with almost no military resistance. And in the eastern Donbass that same year, Russian-backed separatists carved out two breakaway republics with a combination of local proxies, covert military support, and political chaos in Kyiv. None of that required an overwhelming commitment of force, only the fact that Ukraine was caught unaware and reeling from its own economic issues. There was also a significant intelligence failure layered beneath the doctrinal one. Russian military intelligence, GRU, and the FSB both reportedly assessed Ukraine's will to resist as low. Part of this was simply because Russian intelligence networks in Ukraine were optimized for political infiltration and economic leverage, not for accurately assessing military morale and combat readiness. Part of it may have been deliberate distortion by analysts who understood that delivering bad news to Putin was professionally dangerous. Whatever the cause, the assessment was that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would flee, that Ukrainian military units would stand down, and that the population would welcome Russia like there was still a Soviet nation. All of it proved catastrophically wrong within the first 72 hours. Ukrainian territorial defense units flooded recruiting offices. Civilians made Molotov cocktails. Zelensky famously declined an evacuation offer. The psychological collapse that Russia had planned its entire operation around simply didn't happen. No plan survives first contact with an enemy, especially one that's decided collectively and defiantly not to comply with it. With Plan A going nowhere and there being no Plan B, the war becoming one of attrition was practically a foregone conclusion. The exact reason why Russian intelligence failed to capture that vital tidbit of information and arguably start the war was that Ukraine changed massively, and it has no one but Russia to thank for that. After 2014, Ukraine started moving closer to the West in terms of ideology, but it also approached NATO to train its forces. That meant 8 years of world-class training, Western equipment donations, and experienced veterans from the Donbass fighting. The result was a campaign built on a fantasy. Russian forces advanced in multiple directions simultaneously, toward Kyiv from the north, toward Kharkiv in the northeast, and toward Kherson in the south. This spread their already insufficient force across an enormous front, on the assumption that none of these axes would face serious resistance, and that the Ukrainian resistance would collapse once the capital was threatened. When Ukrainian forces stopped them cold at Hostomel Airport, which was the planned gateway for an airborne seizure of Kyiv for the very first day of the invasion, the entire logic of the operation began to unravel. This directly led to the famous 40-mile tank convoys, which were now stuck because the first operation in the war went terribly, and Russia couldn't back out since it never planned to. By April 1st, 2022, barely 5 weeks into what was supposed to be a 3 to 10 day operation, Russia was retreating from the entire Kyiv Oblast. It had revealed to the entire watching world that its military was a paper tiger built on corruption, inadequate training, and decades of institutional mythology about its own invincibility. But here's the critical point, and this is what the rest of this video is about. The retreat from Kyiv was not the end of Russia's overconfidence problem. It was just the first and most visible consequence of it. The deeper ones were still working their way through the system. And for that, we need to dig again into Russia's military doctrine, or rather, how it planned to wage wars in general. Russian military doctrine, in its modern form, is a direct descendant of Soviet deep battle theory, a concept developed in the late 1920s and 1930s. The core idea was elegant and hinged on the idea that rather than grinding through enemy lines from front to back, you attack simultaneously along the enemy's entire military. This included the front line, reserves, logistics, and even command centers, creating simultaneous crises everywhere so that the enemy can't respond to all at once. In practice, this requires immense coordination between air and ground troops, command and logistics. Vitally, it posits that all the orders come from above and are distributed down the chain of command without modifications. But this method has one catastrophic vulnerability. It only works if your command and control are functioning. If orders don't get through, commanders can't talk to each other, or tactical units lose contact with their operational headquarters, the whole synchronized machine grinds to a halt. And here's where one of the most overlooked advantages Ukraine brought to this fight comes into play. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union until 1991. Its military officers grew up inside Soviet doctrine, and they attended Soviet military academies. When Russia launched its invasion, Ukraine was fighting an enemy that it intimately knew, particularly since the enemy was playing by the same rulebook it used just 8 years before. And Ukraine adapted to the fullest. Beginning after 2014 and accelerating under direct NATO guidance from 2016 onward, Ukraine deliberately retrained its officer corps away from Soviet-style command structures and toward a NATO mission command philosophy. In the old Soviet model, which Russia still uses, orders flow downward rigidly, and subordinate commanders need to execute those orders with minimal deviation. The system is designed to be controlled from the top. Ukraine deliberately broke that model. It trained its company and battalion commanders to make independent decisions based on the enemy's intent and the most advantageous position at the time, without waiting for permission from above. It focused on units that could work in isolation, precisely because they would be forced to when pitted against a larger enemy. This mattered enormously for two reasons. First, it made Ukrainian forces far more resilient under Russian electronic warfare and signals intelligence operations. Russia's jamming capabilities were designed to target the centralized communication architecture of a Soviet-style military, where you had a single brigade network, a few key nodes, and predictable radio frequencies. Against a decentralized force communicating over short distances through many small nodes, those tools became far less effective. Case in point, Ukrainian small unit commanders organized ambushes using anti-tank weapons and operated with irregular tactics that consistently surprised Russian forces expecting a structured, predictable opponent. Second, and more directly relevant to the opening months of the war, Ukrainian commanders at every level understood exactly how a Russian unit would behave under pressure, because they'd been trained in the same system and knew precisely where the pressure points were. And the most visible pressure point was the Russian chain of command itself. As mentioned, Russian military doctrine concentrates authority at the top and expects senior officers to manage tactical situations personally. This also means they move forward to supervise operations directly. Ukraine recognized this pattern and systematically targeted Russian command vehicles, communications equipment, and the commanders themselves. The kill rate among senior Russian officers in the early months of the war was staggering by any historical comparison. Russia lost 5 generals to Ukrainian artillery and precision strikes in the first weeks of the conflict. This showcased just how fragile the system was when you needed high-ranking officers near the front line and had an enemy that could take advantage of that. The Russian military doctrine also makes extreme use of air power, which is another vital breaking point that led to the war becoming as is. For one, Russian ground combat mechanics practically assume air superiority. The entire theory of combined arms deep battle requires that Russian aviation is free to operate in support of ground forces. This includes suppressing enemy defenses, striking logistics, and even providing close air support to advancing infantry and armor. As such, Russian ground formations are not designed to fight without that overhead cover. Their tactics, formations, and the tempo of combat they were designed to sustain all presuppose that the skies would be theirs and there'd be someone to back them up. But the skies over Ukraine didn't belong to Russia for a single day of this war. This can also be traced directly back to Russia's opening overconfidence. To achieve air superiority, you must first suppress enemy air defenses. So Russia launched over 1,100 missiles at Ukrainian targets in the first 3 weeks of the war, striking, or attempting to, at about 75% of Ukraine's anti-air defenses. But Ukraine had dispersed its mobile surface-to-air missile systems before the invasion began, saving most of them from the initial strikes. From that point, the Russian Aerospace Forces, or VKS, were operating in a contested environment they hadn't planned for against an air defense network they had failed to destroy, with a stockpile of precision munitions already depleting rapidly. By early April 2022, barely 6 weeks into the war, the VKS had effectively stopped attempting to penetrate Ukrainian airspace in any sustained way. It retreated to launch standoff strikes from Russian territory well outside of the range of Ukrainian air defenses. But without close air support on the scale originally envisioned, Russian armor and infantry often had to advance with limited overhead protection. And without effective air interdiction of Ukrainian supply lines, Western weapons kept flowing to the front. Without fully suppressing Ukrainian artillery, those artillery systems continued to operate and inflict heavy losses. Every ground offensive Russia has conducted since April 2022 has been shaped by its inability to establish the kind of air dominance that most modern militaries would consider essential. Rather than acknowledging that their doctrine had failed and rebuilding around a new reality, Russian military theorists largely concluded that their concepts were correct all along, and that the failures were due to poor execution and unforeseen Western support for Ukraine, not fundamental flaws in their doctrine. So Russia was overconfident to the point where their system couldn't admit its own failure, playing the same tune for months on end while its soldiers died. And once those opening months ended and the siege of Kyiv was a part of military history, Russia itself started to decline. By that point, most analysts were starting to realize it was going to be a long war. But a long war meant Russia needed to mobilize its actual military power, the kind it hadn't deployed in February because it hadn't thought it would need to. Most importantly, Russia would need more modern equipment and access to technology, but by that time, the window to acquire it had already closed. Just hours after the invasion began, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and dozens of allied nations imposed the most comprehensive package of economic sanctions in modern history. Over the following weeks and months, those sanctions were specifically and deliberately targeted at the technology inputs that Russian military production depends on. They stripped Russia of accessing microelectronics, semiconductors, advanced machine tools, and precision manufacturing equipment. It meant Russia couldn't build new guidance chips, communications hardware, or even advanced drone control systems. The reason why the sanctions were particularly devastating was that Russia is a big hypocrite. Russia's military-industrial base had been dependent on Western and Western-aligned technology supply chains for decades. Its modern missiles use Western microelectronics. Its tanks use Western-made machine tools in their manufacturing process. Its electronic warfare systems required advanced chipsets that Russia's own semiconductor industry couldn't produce domestically. This all comes from the Royal United Services Institute, which documented this dependency, suggesting that anything that Russia needed for the military, it was the Western supply chain that provided it. Of course, sanctions never have immediate consequences. Russia had some of the largest stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment, and a lot of that equipment was simply shelved rather than dismantled. So it could feasibly throw it back into the war. But Russia couldn't replace those stockpiles with modern equivalents. The scramble that followed tells you everything about how badly Russia had miscalculated. Russia quickly turned to Iran for Shahed attack drones. These are loitering munitions that Tehran had been developing for years, and that Russia, in its overconfidence about its own capabilities, had never bothered to invest in seriously before the war. Then, it turned to North Korea for artillery ammunition, reportedly importing millions of shells on par with its domestic production. When that failed, it was time for the stockpiles. So out came the T-62 tanks that were built in the 1960s and 1970s. After that, there were reports of T-55s and even T-34s, equipment that was actually used in World War II. The latter efforts were laughable, and Western news outlets and our own videos showed just how pointless it is to bring a World War II tank to a modern battlefield. But they were numbers, and they managed to give Russia just a bit more time to sustain its war effort. But this was meant to be fighting a war at a dramatically lower technological level. And the critical point here is the timing. If Russia had entered the war with its full military weight from day one, the sanctions still would have come, but they would have arrived in a Russia that had already achieved its core objectives and occupied the territory it wanted. The sanctions would have been applied to a Russia that was consolidating a victory, not one that was scrambling to survive a war it had fumbled the opening of. By that point, Russia could overturn the sanctions by having a new swathe of territory, rich with resources, and China as an ever-willing buyer for them. But by choosing overconfidence over overwhelming force, Russia ensured that the sanctions arrived while it was still fighting and before it had achieved anything that would have given it leverage to negotiate their removal. With all of that context established, we can now look at the drone war. Remember, this isn't a separate phenomenon from what we've seen so far. Even here, Russia's overconfidence is arguably the deciding factor in how Ukraine has managed to defend itself for so long. Here, we can separate the war into three different fronts: the close fight at the front line, the middle strike campaign around the occupied regions of Ukraine and neighboring Russian oblasts, and the deep strike campaign targeting Russian territory itself. And Ukraine is winning all three. On the front line, the numbers are brutal. By mid-2026, Small FPV drones, which are drones carrying explosive warheads, often costing just a few $100s to manufacture, accounted for around 80% of all casualties on the battlefield. Both sides use them, but Ukraine has pulled decisively ahead. Russia made some progress in closing the tactical drone gap in 2025, which was partly responsible for the battlefield gains it made that year. But that progress has stalled, and for a simple reason: Russia can't recruit the people it needs to operate its drone forces effectively. Russia's unmanned systems forces set ambitious targets for recruiting tech-savvy young graduates. These were exactly the kind of people who have the reflexes and spatial awareness to operate FPV drones effectively in a fast-paced, high-pressure combat environment. In 4 months of active recruiting, they hit only 16% of their target. The underlying reason is not complicated, as joining the Russian military is simply not attractive to educated young Russians. They're well aware of what happens at the front, and they don't even have any enforceable guarantee that they won't be reassigned from a drone control station to an assault infantry unit the moment a commander needs bodies for an attack. Then there was Russia's attempt to expand its premier Rubicon drone unit. This was once the most capable formation on the Russian side and was responsible for Ukraine steadily losing access to drone infrastructure. But as entry standards dropped and Russia tried to scale it to fill the entire front line, the resulting force was much larger but dramatically less capable. Finally, Russia stumbled under the curse of its own military doctrine again. Instead of letting the unmanned forces be relatively independent from the rest of the frontline efforts, Russia tried to centralize their operations to be in line with major assaults. This ultimately meant Russia was throwing drones at Ukraine where they were actually expected, and Ukraine could use its most sophisticated defenses to counter them. The result was that some of Russia's most capable drone operating units had fewer drones and fewer operators. A big reason why Ukraine has managed to do this is precisely that it doesn't have a rigid command structure, and its innovation mechanism follows suit. On the Russian side, the drones might be innovated upon quickly, but they still succumb to Russia's lack of independence when it comes to testing and using them. But when Ukrainian drone operators identify a Russian countermeasure, they immediately start designing a response to test in the field within days. A new variant of the drone can reach frontline units within weeks. This feedback loop from the front line to the factory is short, fast, and supported by Ukraine, having all manufacturers endlessly testing and working with pooled resources, primarily through the Brave One cluster. Russia's equivalent loop needs to run through layers of command approval, procurement bureaucracy, and a military culture that historically punishes tactical initiative rather than rewarding it. The result is a technological gap that widens not because Ukraine has more resources, but because it iterates faster. And given that drones have become practically ubiquitous, that speed of evolution is all that matters. And when Russia tried to innovate, it got hit by the sanctions again. Russia invested heavily in fiber-optic guided FPV drones. This is a genuinely novel tactical option because fiber optic control is immune to electronic jamming. In fact, in early reports, Ukraine was more afraid of fiber optic drones than anything else in the short-range portion of the front line. Russia was the first country to use the drones this way, and arguably the reason why Ukraine followed suit. The drones were simply that effective when there was hardly a way to disable them. But a 50-kilometer spool of fiber optic cable that costs around $300 in 2022 costs around $2,500 in 2026, all because the global supply chain for this material has tightened dramatically as demand from both sides of the war has surged. Surprisingly, both Ukraine and Russia import most of their cable from the same Chinese suppliers, showing how China is actually playing both sides of the conflict for economic advantages. Ukraine is far less reliant on cable-guided drones, already having hedged into radio control systems that can be mass-produced far more cheaply. Russia made a significant technological bet and is now paying a premium for it that compounds with every passing month. Ukraine also has the advantage of having the motivation and the innovation culture that a grinding attritional war forces on the defending side. Ukrainian drone operators are fighting for their homes, and it has Starlink. The near-total removal of Russia's access to Elon Musk's satellite communications network was genuinely game-changing. There is no Russian equivalent to Starlink, no cheap, near-unjammable, high-speed satellite communications system available to frontline units. That asymmetry shows up in every single tactical drone engagement. Moving up to the middle strike domain, the 13 to 130 mile band between the front line and Russia's rear areas. In here, Ukraine has transformed this space into a systematic degradation campaign. President Zelensky announced in early May 2026 that missile strikes had doubled since March and quadrupled since February. So Ukraine moved from defending itself to actively aiming to cut Russia's access to the front line, all through drone warfare. The Center for Information Resilience tracked a 300% increase in Ukrainian attacks on Russian air defense and electronic warfare assets in just March and April of 2026. That was nearly 80 systems targeted in 8 weeks. Air defense systems are expensive, slow to manufacture, and the cumulative loss creates a feedback loop. Each system destroyed makes the next drone raid more effective, which makes it easier to destroy more systems, which enables deeper and heavier strikes, and so on. For the middle range, Ukraine has been increasingly relying on domestic production, peaking with the FP2 drone. It carries a 220-pound warhead, capable of destroying or at least disabling any Russian armored vehicle, and it's been used to devastating effect against Russian air defense systems in particular. When German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius visited Ukrainian frontline command centers in May 2026, Ukrainian commanders showed him footage of FP2 drones demolishing Russian air defense systems one by one. The symbolism was that Ukraine already had drones that were on par with anything the West could design, and these drones were now finding targets. For Russia, this meant it had to reorganize the campaign again. Before, Russian ammunition dumps and command posts could sit 40 to 50 miles out of the front lines. This was close enough to supply units quickly and for commanders to maintain effective oversight, but out of Ukraine's artillery range and short-range drones. By mid-2026, the ammunition depots had to be moved further back and into Russia's territory. And that wasn't really enough, courtesy of long-range drone warfare we'll discuss a bit later. But when the logistics chain has to run twice as far under constant threat of drone attack, the rest of the structure starts falling apart. Some Russian units have reportedly cut diesel consumption by 20% simply because they can't reliably get fuel forward anymore. Command and control have become fractured. Russian commanders, who are supposed to be managing an active battlefield, are instead coordinating supply lines from increasingly remote positions. This was showcased by Azov Corps footage published on May 8, 2026. It detailed Hornet drones, costing around $5,000 each, compared to the roughly $68,000 Russian Lancet X-51 with a similar profile. The Hornets were flying uncontested at low altitude over the Russian-occupied cities of Donetsk and Mariupol, hunting logistic vehicles along major highways 100 miles behind the front line. The presence of drones over territory that Russia had fought for 4 years to occupy is a good indicator that it's no longer the top dog in the mid-range field. Finally, there's the deep strike portion of the war, where Ukraine has made strides in creating campaigns to target Russia's most important infrastructure, and this is perhaps the biggest reason Russia has been so worried at the victory parade in 2026. When the war started, Ukraine essentially had no domestic long-range strike capability. 4 years later, it launches more than 100,000 drone sorties per month. The strike campaign has targeted Russian oil infrastructure with systematic cumulative intent. Refineries in Krasnodar Krai, Ryazan, Perm, Stavropol, and near the Baltic ports at Primorsk and Ust-Luga have all been hit. The Perm strike in late April 2026 is notable because the facility sits more than 1,000 miles from the Ukrainian border, deep inside the Ural Mountain zone, where Russian planners had arguably considered it beyond practical reach. The pace of strikes on oil infrastructure forced Russia to cut crude production by an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day in April 2026 alone. This was the sharpest monthly decline since the COVID pandemic. Yes, this accounts for a single-digit percentage of the entire production pipeline, but it shows that Ukraine has systems that can meaningfully endanger Russia's economic foundation, since oil and gas historically accounted for almost 40% of the government's revenue. But industrial and military targets have also been a major part of its campaign. Ukrainian drones struck the Radar Scientific and Technical Center in Rostov, a major fertilized plant in Stavropol Krai, producing chemical used in explosives manufacturing, and a Shahid and Iskander component facility in Cheboksary, using Flamingo cruise missiles in May 2026. The last point is critical because it means Ukraine is using drone warfare to disable Russia's own drone warfare capabilities. Behind this lies one of the largest overhauls in military-industrial history, Firepoint. This startup was founded by engineers, architects, and game designers in makeshift workshops in 2022. 4 years later, it produces a signature 100 FP1 drones per day at a unit cost of around $55,000. The FP1 has a range of 1,000 miles and is primarily used for surveillance and single-target precision strikes. Another hallmark is the FP5 Flamingo cruise missile, with a stated range of 1,800 miles and a 2,200-pound warhead. President Zelensky described it as Ukraine's most successful missile. But Firepoint has not stopped at the Flamingo. In February 2026, the company conducted the first test launch of the FP7 medium-range ballistic missile, with a supposed range of around 130 miles, just enough to match the aforementioned mid-strike targets. And in March, Firepoint chief designer Dennis Stielerman announced the FP9, a longer-range, heavier ballistic missile that the company claims would reach Moscow by summer 2026. The key for the FP9 is speed. While Russia's Iskander ballistic missile impacts at around 800 meters per second, Stielerman says that the FP9 will hit at over 1,200, fast enough to outpace interceptor missiles that surround Russia's most vital targets. It's estimated that 1 in 4 FP9s could feasibly reach their intended targets. For a country that couldn't build a drone 4 years ago, that's something that Russia needs to rethink. This is the compounding problem Russia faces on the deep strike front. Each new drone that Ukraine designs and lobs at Russian forces forces Russia to invest in more air defense and push more strategic assets farther from the front. Even more importantly, the Kremlin then has to create more propaganda, explaining to its citizens why the war they were told was under control keeps arriving in their refineries, their airports, and possibly even in the capital city. Taken together, the three fronts of the drone war paint a single coherent picture. A country that entered this conflict with every conventional advantage is now being systematically dismantled by a smaller adversary that had no choice but to innovate, and that's been doing so in a live fire testing environment for 4 years straight. Now, if you want to learn more about any particular type of drone that Ukraine uses, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show. We post daily videos that detail exactly how drones are used, where they're used, and how effective they are at any given day. One of the most elegant aspects of Ukraine's technological evolution is the way it's inverted what defense analysts call the cost exchange problem. In conventional warfare, this problem is central to any attacker's calculus. It costs far more to shoot down a weapon than to launch it, which means an attacker can eventually exhaust a defender's interceptor stockpile by flooding the zone with cheap munitions. Russia has been attempting this strategy with its Shahed-type attack drones, mass-producing them at the Alabuga Special Economic Zone in Tatarstan and launching them in waves of hundreds at a time. Ukraine has flipped this equation and done so in a way that compounds in its favor. Ukraine's Sting FPV interceptor drone cost approximately $2,100. The cheapest Russian Shahed-type drone cost a minimum of $35,000 per unit, nearly 15 times as much. During Russia's massive drone assault in mid-May 2026, it used 1,567 attack drones launched in a single coordinated strike. Ukraine intercepted 1,473 of them, meaning it managed a 94% interception rate. The Sting alone accounted for over 100 kills. Interceptor drones overall accounted for roughly 30% of all the drones brought down. That's a cost exchange that favors Ukraine by an order of magnitude in every single engagement. More importantly, the Sting is built from commercially available components using 3D printing. It requires no specialized manufacturing infrastructure. It doesn't even depend on high-end microelectronics that might be restricted by sanctions or disrupted by supply chain shocks. Ukraine can build more of them quickly and cheaply in distributed manufacturing facilities that are themselves difficult to target. Russia's Shahed program, conversely, is still a sustained production effort conducted at centralized facilities. It also heavily depends on cooperating with Iranian suppliers, and Iran itself isn't faring so well, considering it has its own conflict to fight in the Middle East. Ukraine's success in the drone war has not gone unnoticed by the rest of the world. By March 2026, over 200 Ukrainian drone pilots had deployed to the Persian Gulf to help US and Gulf state forces counter Iranian drone attacks. Ukraine's SkyMap anti-drone command and control platform was operating at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia after Iranian Shahed drones caused more than $1 billion in damage to US facilities in the region. Defense agreements were signed with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. A drone cooperation deal with the United States was described as currently being reviewed at different institutional levels. The country that Russia invaded, expecting to eliminate as a geopolitical entity in a weekend, has become a recognized global leader in unmanned warfare with paying clients. Russia, meanwhile, is running in the opposite direction on every metric. Its electronic warfare capability is degrading because the microelectronics it requires are increasingly difficult to source. Its drone operator recruiting is falling dramatically short of its own targets. Its fiber optic FPV program is being kneecapped by a supply chain cost surge of its own making. Every direction it turns to solve its technological problems leads back to sanctions it invited by making the strategic choice of overconfidence in February 2022. There is a fourth dimension to this conflict that receives less attention than the tactical one, but may ultimately matter just as much: the psychological and informational war being waged against Russian society itself. Putin's original bargain with Russian citizens was that the war in Ukraine was a special military operation where they didn't have to worry about anything. In fact, Muscovites didn't even need to support the war, as most of the conscripts weren't from there, and the idea was that the fighting would be long over before the repercussions reached large cities. But 4 years later, there is an increasing number of Russian citizens who live within drone range of the Ukrainian border, up to and including Moscow itself. These people have spent 4 years watching Ukrainian drones fly over their cities, strike at Russia's oil infrastructure, light refineries on fire, and ground their airports. Russia even imposed mobile internet restrictions in multiple cities in an attempt to prevent drones from using network signals for navigation, showing just how low it could stoop to try to defend its effort. The question you might be asking at this point is, can't Russia just adapt? Can't it acknowledge the failure, commit the resources it should have committed in the first place, and grind its way to some kind of victory through sheer mass and persistence? The answer is no, and understanding why requires holding all 4 threads of this analysis together simultaneously. The first reason is the sanctions trap, and it deepens with time. Every month that passes, Russia's military-industrial base drifts further behind the technological frontier it needs to compete. The most consequential weapon systems of the modern battlefield, such as drones, AI guidance, and electronic jamming systems, all require the kind of advanced semiconductors and microelectronics that Russia can't easily produce domestically or even reliably import. Yes, it has a lot of sanction evasion schemes, mainly from Central Asia and surrounding China. But these only add to the cost, as Russia has the decisive disadvantage in negotiations. And they can even be disrupted as Western governments refine their enforcement mechanisms. The second reason is manpower mathematics that are now moving in Ukraine's favor. Russia's theory of victory has always depended on a manpower advantage. You send more people, accept more losses, grind the defender down through sheer weight of numbers. For 3 years, that model held. Russia's casualty rate was brutal, but its recruitment rate kept pace. Then in January 2026, that shifted. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Russia's casualty rate surpassed its recruitment rate, according to the Institute for the Study of War. In March 2026, Zelensky estimated that Russia lost approximately 89,000 troops while recruiting only 80,000 over the previous 3 months. The cost per square kilometer has also become catastrophic. Ukrainian estimates suggest Russian forces lost around 120 personnel per square kilometer of captured territory in 2025. By 2026, as drones came to dominate the battlefield, that figure had risen to approximately 316 killed and wounded per square kilometer, more than double in a single year. Russia is paying more and receiving less. Recruitment is collapsing in parallel. Daily recruitment figures for the first quarter of 2026 fell between 800 and 1,000 individuals, a 20% decrease from the 1,000 to 1,200 per day seen in 2025, according to an analysis from Russian Finance Ministry data. Sign-on bonuses reached a new all-time high of 1.47 million rubles, when the average yearly wage is 1.29 million rubles. Yet the numbers kept falling. When you have to keep raising the price and fewer people are still showing up, the market is telling you something. Then there's another demographic trap behind the manpower numbers. The population Russia most needs, that being educated, technically capable young people, is the exact population most determined not to serve. Instead, around 40% of recruits are now drawn from what are vulnerable population groups: prisoners, debtors, and those with few other options. The soldiers Russia is sending to face 21st century drone warfare are increasingly being sourced from the margins of its society, while the people who could actually operate those systems are leaving the country, avoiding conscription, or hiding from the recruitment officers showing up at their workplaces. Third, we have the technological and innovation aspect that we covered. Ukraine has had 4 years of live combat experience developing, iterating, and refining every aspect of unmanned warfare. Its engineers have been testing designs in actual combat conditions with real-time feedback loops measured in days. Its operators have developed tactics that evolve weekly in response to Russian countermeasures. Its commanders have integrated drone intelligence into decision-making at every echelon of the battlefield. This is not knowledge you can acquire by simply throwing money at a problem, and it's vastly different from even the traditional Western model of military procurement and development. And Russia doesn't even have that much more money or people to throw at the problem. GDP growth for 2025 came in at approximately 1%. For 2026, Russia's own government has revised its growth forecast down to just 0.4%, and the economy contracted by 0.3% in the first quarter, its first quarterly contraction since early 2023. Meanwhile, Russia's 2025 military spending was $190 billion, or 7.5% of GDP, the highest share since the Soviet Union's collapse. In 2026, the budget was expected to account for approximately 40% of total federal expenditure, continuing the trend of sky-high investments in the military. Even then, it had to lower the military budget to compensate, admitting that it wasn't enough. To partially fund this, Russia raised its VAT rate from 20% to 22% at the start of 2026. Interest rates that reached 21% to fight military spending-driven inflation have come down to around 16%, which is basically crippling for the civilian economy. And the structural problem runs deeper than any single number. Military-industrial investment is consuming labor, capital, and raw materials at the expense of every other sector. Russia's labor shortage is illustrated by the fact that the official unemployment rate is just 2.2%. This is a figure that sounds like prosperity, but actually reflects the fact that the country has run out of spare workers. In the civilian economy, the part that would need to sustain Russia through a long war, only agriculture and manufacturing showed sustained growth in the first half of 2025. Everything else stagnated or shrank. This matters for the central argument because it closes a door Russia might otherwise have used. A country with a healthy, growing economy can absorb the cost of a long war, retool industries, invest in new technologies, and recruit the people it needs. Russia is doing the opposite. Its economy is shrinking, its military spending is declining in real terms even as the war grinds on. Its civilian industries are being hollowed out because the same people who should be working in them are being conscripted and shipped to fight in the war. The fourth reason is structural, and perhaps the most fundamental. Russia's military is still trying to fight a deep battle war using Soviet command structures against an adversary that has specifically optimized itself to exploit every weakness of that model. The centralization that Russian doctrine requires is a vulnerability Ukraine knows how to target. The air superiority that Russian ground operations assume hasn't existed over Ukraine for 4 years and won't exist for as long as Ukraine has surface-to-air missiles and a functioning industrial base to replace them. And while NATO is responsible for the sanctions that stop Russia from getting access to some weapons, Russia is not losing this war because of NATO. It's not losing because of Western weapons or Ukrainian courage, or Zelensky, or any other of the factors that dominate the mainstream conversation about this conflict. Those things matter, but they're not the cause, just consequences. Russia is losing because in February 2022, the people in charge of the world's largest country looked at their military, looked at Ukraine, and decided they could take it with a fraction of their strength in a weekend without triggering the kind of international response that would close off their technological lifelines. They were wrong about all three things simultaneously, and the three errors compounded each other in ways that were catastrophic and irreversible. The force they sent was definitely not enough to win quickly. The adversary they faced was not the hollow post-Soviet shell they remembered from 2014. And the international response was more comprehensive and more durable than they had calculated. Had they been right about even one of those three things, the strategic outcome might have been different. Being wrong about all three meant they had no way out. By the time Russia understood the scale of its error, it was fighting a war it needed to commit its full weight to, under conditions that prevented it from accessing the technology it required. It was trying to fight a 21st century drone war under a 20th century sanctions regime, with a military doctrine designed for an adversary that had already moved on and a command culture too rigid to adapt at the speed the battlefield demanded. That's not a problem you can solve with more manpower. It's not a problem you can solve with more drones or more missiles or more of anything Russia currently produces. It's not even a problem you can solve with time, because the more time passes, the more Ukraine only gets ahead. Every month, Ukraine's drone industry gets more capable, while Russia's access to the technology it needs gets harder to maintain. The attrition mathematics move further in Ukraine's direction, and maybe the Russian public gets a little more accustomed to drone strikes, airport closures, and oil fires, and a little less certain what the war is actually supposed to accomplish. Which brings us back to Moscow from now on never sleeps. Ukraine has demonstrated that it can strike the Russian capital at will, degrade Russian oil infrastructure at scale, collapse Russian logistics chains from 160 kilometers behind the front line, and shoot down over 90% of the attack drones Russia throws at it for a fraction of their production cost. There's a bit of irony in all of this, where Russia didn't lose because it was weaker than Ukraine, but lost because it was overconfident in its strength. It had the military to win quickly and chose not to use it. That's the only reason this war is still happening, and it's the reason it's not going to end the way Putin intended. And for Putin, that can mean a lot more than just a lost war. To find out more, check out this video, and make sure to subscribe to the Military Show for daily analyses and news in global geopolitics.